Perfect. Thanks, Sean. Appreciate the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with you as a group. I guess if you can launch any of the polls, let's start poll one. If you can bring it up, just happy to have people ping it. All right, Sean, if you want to, I think that's probably enough chats here. If you want to end and publish the poll, if anybody's interested, I just want to get a bit of a read on where everybody's heads at on some of these topics. So you're sharing results. Perfect. All right, so just having a quick look. So AI more productive, yes. You know the costs, but we'll work through it. AI will be a net good. That's certainly interesting to see some of the conversations start to change. I think sort of critical views of AI is one of the prominent turns over the last certainly decade or last 12 months or so. As a net good for humanity, again, little of the jury's a bit out, and then looks like everybody has played with a range of these, certainly the chat bots, perhaps less so with frameworks, coding tools, low code, no code, some agent work, and not yet much with Manus or OpenClaw or similar personal assistants. So, all right, well, let me dive in and share my screen or slides. Judith, pleasure to be here. Good to see everybody dropping in a few comments. Lisa, hello, hello. I see some familiar names as well, so appreciate you taking the time. All right, so I'm going to kind of whine at you actually, and there'll be sections where I'm hoping you'll drop in comments. I may not necessarily see the comments as they're coming in while I'm in share mode, so it may take me a little bit of time to get into it. So one of the things I've been sort of fixated on, and I think probably all of us should be, is the ways in which universities are able to be active contributors to the conversation that's emerging. And my argument is, for whatever reason, universities, at least as it relates to the current configuration of technologies, are more spectators than high agentic organizational members. And so I'm going to make a few assumptions in this talk. So this is background. I'm letting you know I'm not talking about these things. I'm assuming you have some familiarity. And I think some of the responses here kind of bore that out from the opening poll. So a bit that you're familiar with, roughly what generative AI is, how you can use it in your personal life and your professional life, and some degree, some of you had some experience with sort of the agentic or the building work. Somewhat familiar with multimodal models, or my assumption, at least you at least know the audio, video generation, image generation, and potentially some of the newer world generation models, such as the work that Fei Li is doing out of Stanford, or the work that's being done, Google's Genie that was launched, I think, about a week and a half ago or so. Familiar with reasoning models, you're using them regularly. You don't actually have to make explicit choices anymore, but at least some familiarity. Likely aware that you know how AI is encroaching on human capabilities to the point where it's causing a bit of angst on what is the limit to it, and at what point does it start to exceed us. Questions about labor market impact, knowing there's some uncertainty, some speculation that it could be dramatic, some that it may actually increase employment. It's a contested question, even though early indications are that it will be a significant impact. And also that you're aware of the negative aspects of AI around bias, hallucination, IP abuse from existing labs that have decided to sort of go out and use our IP and not necessarily get compensation for it to the original creators. Also, the lack of representativeness. It's largely based on what we would often define as sort of Western framework of knowledge and knowledge structures. And so there's big open questions around what that actually means in terms of an overall impact from some other areas. So, and then and voices, underrepresented voices in particular, are not heard even within our own countries or regions where it is in our language. So there's a lot of concerns around that. The environmental harm, just simply data centers being built and related impacts that has on high AI usage. And finally, human harm, which you're starting to see emerge with some of the lawsuits being brought against companies like OpenAI. So making assumptions that you have a little bit of familiarity with that. What I want to spend time on, though, are four critical points. One, that we are somewhat spectatoring our future as it emerges, and that's not a tenable position for us to hold. I want to address a little bit the AI landscape in education, what that looks like and how it's changing, and also want to address some of the questions around openness. I see some people in the group here who are much more capable to address some of the core concept of openness than I am. But nonetheless, I'll sort of address what some of the concerns are there. And then I want to emphasize what I'm really trying to get to, which is it's a systems problem and it requires some change that goes beyond what we're necessarily doing individually. So let's talk about spectators into our future. So higher education in general has been slow to make some meaningful or even systemic changes that respond to growing end user agencies. Now, that sounds more aggressive than I necessarily mean it. My core argument, though, is that as technologies have been made available that give greater power to an end user, whether it is to learn, to access resources, to engage in different learning formats, to be able to express their thoughts, blogs and wikis and social media and other tools, that there's been greater capabilities given to the end user, the ability for end users to find people who are more aligned with themselves, either their place in society or the particular interests that they have or particular dynamics of who they are, greater control. I'd still argue modern systems have not sufficiently addressed the issue of Web 2.0. We don't really have a participatory, engaged infrastructure of learning in most universities to the degree that these technologies actually make possible. And so I think these kinds of challenges, AI is one of it, but and the growing influence of corporate presence, my argument is universities are not necessarily aligning well to meet these challenges. And in some ways, especially as it relates to AI, we're spending too much of our time engaging and responding to forces that, we only have some marginal ability to influence. And we need to, for lack of a better word, recognize that these platforms, these frontier labs, the geopolitical realities, certainly Canada is facing that now, while Europe and Greenland and others as well, with changing political structures. So we're in many ways not actively driving the agenda of higher education. In fact, we're buffeted by any range of enrollment trends and other factors that require some rethinking, I believe, of how we approach things. And it is a sequence of emerging truths that the system faces. And these are not absolute. They're in some cases more relevant in certain regions than others. But for example, higher education is an economically dubious proposition, not everywhere, but in certain domains. Now, I'm not talking higher education as a mechanism of growth. I'm talking higher education as an opportunity to find employment, which is the primary framing that most individuals have for higher education. We know it's not just that, it's much broader. But at minimum, the argument, especially in countries like the US, where much of the tuition is placed on the individual, it's a difficult proposition to argue for in many domains. Similarly, credentials have diminishing value. Degrees matter less than they used to, and more of a focus on, skills and capabilities are starting to emerge as a critical pillar. There's also a growing recognition that the capability of AI to advance is resulting in a return or a focus on human or durable skills. And as a result, the challenges that this entails or creates for us results a range of new opportunities, both to learn, grow, and develop. But there's a second component of it, which is these aren't rewarded from an employment perspective. It may make us better humans, but that doesn't necessarily mean for first jobs or for entry into the labor market that they're necessarily rewarded. And finally, there's a growing attention to public trust and confidence in education. Canada still has really high confidence from the broad population on the value of education, but different regions of the world have diminishing trust and confidence in the university system compared to what it once had. So these truths, I think, require some level of confrontation, especially against the backdrop of AI and against this big question of how do we as systems, even though we are one of the top users of these organizations or these services, these technologies, we are actually not in the conversation the way that we should be. So, for example, last year, mid-year, three different labs launched some level of a learning related product, whether it was sort of dialogic or Socratic learning. And all three of them ended up developing this without any substantive engagement with faculty that we are aware of, at least. With the exception of Google, they did an interesting project called Learn LM. There was a paper they did about 18 months ago that influenced roughly what their platform was, heavily focused on learning sciences. But we're primarily net end users of what's being produced in these labs. And I think that's the point I'm trying to rail against in our ability to be more meaningfully engaged and more actively shaping the structure of what that is. So that's my opening hypothesis, is that we're not actively engaged enough in the technologies, the models, and the approaches that will impact our future. Now, we've seen a couple of cycles of change, at least technologically. I noticed somebody dropped in a comment, Wikipedia is a good example of another tool or resource that's had a big impact. And certainly it's not a definitive list. It's just trying to get a bit of a shape of the conversation. So if you look at the cycles as it relates kind of to open education, this isn't the university sector writ large, but since early 2000s, we've had quite a bit of resources being developed by uh, universities that have made them freely available. And in some instances, it's the equivalent of an OER. Sometimes it's an open textbook resource. Some, OpenStax and others have made that, entire focus to make a sequence of tools available to the university sector in general. Certain prominent textbooks across, BC certainly has been a leader on this. Alberta made a bit of a run at it, but kind of fizzled a little bit while I was at Athabasca. But nonetheless, there's the idea of open education. We can scale content, whether it was MIT's OCW or a lot of other work that individuals have done to just openly license core content. It's easy to scale, easy to share. Since 2008, the growing attention to open content, we've had this idea that we can scale instruction. And we are able to have individuals right now. You can go to any number of platforms or providers or even just personally hosted courses. I don't know, Stephen Downs has run, numerous range of open courses. I think, as Shauna referenced, Alec Koros has run sequence of MOOCs as well. So you don't need to be tied to a big provider or platform, but you can just make stuff free. Is basically what it boils down to. And that's been a big impact. And I think there's a possibility then, if we've scaled content, we've scaled instruction, there's a capability that AI can contribute to scaling engagement or scaling some level of learning in that regard. We did a paper, meta review of what was being uh, done around AI in the education system, and basically wanted to look at how are people researching and writing about AI in education actually expressing themselves or expressing the needs or the capabilities that they're facing. And we found it was written pre-ChatGPT, published just after it came out, but a lot of the benefits are ones that are still relevant today. Generative AI didn't change these as areas of focus, but a big interest in terms of personalized learning. And again, this is a meta-analysis. It's a systemic review, something that Melissa Bond, who is the lead author on this, does an exceptional job of. But as a group, we looked at a range of what people were saying as benefits. I think we could all agree, yeah, this would be great if AI did that. We also have a list of critical challenges, and these relate to some of the ethical dynamics. These relate to things like curriculum development. How do we effectively and meaningfully use it for that? The infrastructure that's needed, teachers, technical knowledge. There's also a big open question of shifting authority. Now, what happened once ChatGPT came out, we started to see a lot of attention and use with this. And we did a paper where we looked at how is this actually being used from a student agency perspective. And what we found was, really the take home message was, and this has been validated. I've seen report after report now that share something similar, but basically just says, look, people are relying on AI, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're learning from AI. And that has important implications in terms of how do we want the university model as a whole to sort of be structured or to be unpacked. How important is traditional learning in our expectation of what happens in a modern sort of complex ecosystem? And the reason I'm saying how important is learning is the argument could be made that if you track what's happened with software engineering over the last 12 months, where it moved from limited value in coding to now many software engineers, once they've defined the specs, the outcomes, and the goals, would say that much of the coding is happening just by AI. So they're still doing the work of planning and assessment and evaluation of quality of output, but that the core coding act by and large is AI done. Something that even the creator of Claude Code said with Claude Cowork, it was 100% written by AI. And so I'm just flagging that to say, in that regard, do you still need the same learning impact as you've had in the past, or do you have an escalation to more complex cognitive tasks such as sense making, meaning making, planning, and so on? We also had to focus, this is just a pre-chat GPT as well, where we were looking at what are the expectations of a human cognitive system and an artificial cognitive system. And the big challenge is, how do you get these two to meaningfully interact? Google just dropped a paper yesterday or last couple of days that looked at exactly this. How do we decide which tasks are AI managed and which tasks are human managed? And of course, we know that's a changing landscape. What we might today say fits in one category, tomorrow may fit in another. But it's an important question, especially in the education system, is what part of the cognitive process needs to be human managed versus AI managed? Part of these changes produced a need, and I think an important one is that we start thinking about how to more rapidly address question response, research outputs in such a way that we're able to deliver a key outcome that meets the needs of individuals where they exist. So rather than a 6-month, 12-month research process, we set up a journal, Learning Letters, where we explicitly looked at, can you take an idea to publication in a much tighter timeline and without the usual 18, 20-page papers with an academic out or manuscript? Can you do something that fits in 3, 4 pages that gets the results out fast versus the broad situated in traditional literature? And we just did a paper that was published late last year that looked at how universities have to rethink exams. And again, AI's impact here is, where does it shift from a duplication of existing practices in universities to something that enables entirely new outcomes or entirely new approaches? And so these were sort of the original framings that we had around where AI sits in this landscape of teaching and learning. You can throw dozens and dozens of papers at this as well. I'm sure you're all aware that there's growing publications out, some with varying degrees of quality, but certainly there's a lot of attention being paid to these open questions. But I want to return to, before I shift to the next section, this idea that LLMs as these core infrastructure that underpins much of the offerings that we're seeing in universities, whether, as someone noted, they're coming from a vendor provider that didn't ask for input. I think Daryl made some statement around what you actually want, but they're just kind of thrown at you. And these are the tools that you have. So I think one of the things I want to put in place here, that regardless of the status and the ongoing development of these technologies, LLMs, the degree to which they've plateaued, the degree to which they continue to develop, there's a whole sequence of value adds that are being developed around it. And this will matter towards the end of the presentation, where I'm talking more about openness. So it's not just that, are we using an open model? And there certainly are good open models right now, many of them, coming out of China, but there's promising ones, out of Europe as well. But the question is, when you talk about the openness structure, it's the sequence of value points that we add into this infrastructure that starts to make an impact. How do you manage things like memory? Forget some of these specific concepts, but how do you manage memory? How do you manage agentic workflows? How do you pull together some of these concepts in a way that you're creating a great experience that supports a learner, but you're not necessarily 100% committed to proprietary platforms or proprietary systems? So I'll get to that a little bit later. Now, one of the things that we as university sector face in particular is we get data from a lot of different outputs, and we then, if we have a properly managed data infrastructure, which is in most universities actually a significant liability, but if we have a properly managed data structure, we can get a very solid line of sight into a learner and into a learner's capabilities. Now, when we manage that well, we get something that looks like a profile of a learner combined with what a learner actually needs to know. And that's fed into an LLM that results in some level of personalization in a way that we just simply haven't been able to do in the past. And we've spent the last 2.5 years building sort of exactly this infrastructure. And finding that the ability for personalization with early work that's come out of Carnegie Mellon and others with tutors and adaptive tutors and Newton and other personalized platform, we were long promised this, but now it's a surprisingly easy process compared to what we faced in the past. Now, I'm not saying it's a solved problem. There are still a lot of values in traditional machine learning approaches and traditional personalization approaches, but we are seeing high capability for LLMs to provide a personalized learning experience if we can bring the right kind of data into the prompt or the LLM's engagement. And again, I'm just setting up the context for openness a little later, but we similarly see the growth of AI agents, and regardless of how you frame them, whether you go with, Russell and Norvig's seminal text on, what agents are and the criteria agents should have, or some of the sloppier, newer ones, like what's been made available, Andrew Ng has sort of offered a view of agents as basically being able to solve problems within a certain kind of a context. And essentially, though, agents are, we'll call it a system that often relies on and uses LLMs to be able to act and make decisions on behalf of an individual. And so I would argue that roughly anything that we do can be done by agents. And whether it's parts of recruitment and registration, even in advanced marketing and promotion, if that's a focus of university, wellness work, direction through the student experience, creating content, teaching, coaching, assessing, evaluation, even research. In almost all areas, agents can elevate the performance of an individual. Doesn't mean they're going to completely replace the activity and the action that students are here. But I think the important component that I'm trying to unpack with this, for the hype and everything else, taking all the terms I stated at the start for expectations of your capabilities, the argument I'm trying to get at is we need to start thinking about the ways in which these very flawed LLM systems with the right level of support architecture around it can actually drive and help make an impact on the university system. I'm not saying it needs to be a 100% light switch in a month, but I am saying this is directionally where some of these outcomes are trending. And so it's roughly a range of these tools and capabilities, taking Karpathy's quote in context, need to be wrapped around with support layers that ultimately enable us to kind of make that impact for students. Okay, so if that's the general framing in the background that we're up against when it comes to some of these tools, I want to dive a little bit into some parts of the openness-ish question. Now, I'm assuming all of you are familiar with Wiley's 5 Rs, but we essentially need to say, okay, what part of the education process with these tools starts to change, and what parts actually are still in partially development stage? And the critical question that I'd like to work through, or sequence of questions, and this came out, it was an interesting paper that I think, I saw it via OL Daily. It just came out yesterday or last week or so, but it was the focus that we can't talk, and it's no longer enough to just focus on content as being free and openly licensed. There's a range of questions around the system that support openness. And I remember this years ago, I was talking to a few colleagues, and I started some work with learning analytics specifically, and I met with a colleague, Gardner Campbell, actually. We sat down, had a conference, and he's like, "Why are you doing this?" And he's direct, transparent, basically saying the sort of compressing effects of analytics that strips part of the human layer of the learning process is consequential. And if you rely on analytics to make decisions that are best made by a human observer, what's the harm that's being done to the education system? And I think one of the things I'd like to emphasize here, and same point I made in that argument, was this is the direction where things are going. And even if we don't 100% agree with it, being involved from my stance in that conversation enables some capability of impact that may not be possible if you're 100% on the outside of it. Again, that's a Pollyanna-ish view, but the argument here is we need to get into the conversations of infrastructure, of technical system, of tools, and even pedagogical practices, especially if we want to nudge them and move them towards something that's a little more open-ish. So I'm going to pause here and briefly start or throw out a few series of questions. From your end, some of you, I know a few names in the room here that have spent a lot of time in this conversation. Um, my first question would be what does or how, in what ways does AI change openness? I don't know if microphones are accessible to others, but feel free to either put a comment in here to the opening question on this slide or grab the mic if you prefer to address. Paul, to your question, who is we? We is the opening we that I introduced as the university sector writ large, the system of higher education. To my opening argument was we need to be more capably able to own our future in a way that serves the needs of learners. I'm not sure if that's too big and too fuzzy, but that's roughly the framing. Yeah, I hear your point. Just seeing the comment in here, LLMs, I don't think they consider them free and openly licensed. I don't think they actually cared at all. I think it's more like we're just going to use it all. It was interesting to see Disney and some OER or some of the models recently sort of lament at the growing influence of Chinese media models that were outperforming many of the ones that we have access to. And I think a big challenge there was the groups now, the OER systems that are now saying, hey, they're taking these well-developed models that we've created and they distill them down into smaller, more performant models that are still highly impactful. But as Google was saying, they're essentially just taking, the weights or the models that we've created and generating a more performant, lower or smaller size model, which to them is now IP theft. But again, the entire infrastructure was created on IP theft in the first place. Paul, AI disincentive has a disincentive effect on openness. Any reason why? I'm not sure if you can grab the mic, but if you can, I'd love to hear your thoughts on in what way that is the case. Let's see. And 100%. I mean, there's a sense in which the models that we're now having access to, and I'm sure some of you are probably playing with tools locally, either on your device or on your phone with smaller models, or in some cases, open models, obviously that Llama initially kicked off a number of years ago and since shied away from. Even those models are based, the model itself is open, but the original content used to create the models is a form of theft. The other part is if you're creating resources, and this is one of the things the paper I shared earlier, there's a number of them that are addressing a similar problem, essentially leaves the question of, what possibly is openly licensable that comes from an output of an LLM. And there's the disincentivizing factor of if we create content now, it's sort of vacuumed up and brought into systems if it's freely or publicly available. And Sean, I think interesting point that you're raising there as well. In fact, I'd love for you to talk a little more on that because there's a lack of respect in general. And you know that Anthropic and OpenAI are in the middle of a number of lawsuits. Anthropic had a huge payout, even though it was vastly undervalued for what they got out of the public space. Even when they were building, OpenAI was building their vision and their image models, they used YouTube as a lot of their model training work. But obviously, there's no attribution or recognition there. And if you recall sort of the famous interview where Miro was kind of deer in the headlights look around questions related to where they train their model on. I'm going to thank you, Shauna, and others for the comments in. I'm going to follow up with a question, I guess, if anyone has opinions on which conditions are no longer true or which ones become more important. Because at some level, back to the licensing question, from just simply open licensing of content. Now, that's a small part of what is required to be open now, given the prominence of different AI tools or infrastructures. But what parts of that is no longer true? Notably, if you have an open textbook, how relevant is that compared to, say, having an open knowledge graph, for example, which is then used and brought into any kind of related content or curricular outputs? So be curious to hear if there's conditions you feel that are no longer true and ones that you feel are perhaps more important than the way the OER movement was initially focused, which was heavily content based. So one of the points then is if much of what we now know or have known in the past to be key to the OER framing, the question starts to become where do we shift the open question in this type of emerging landscape? And there's a few points have already been noted around the infrastructure. I know the Apereo Foundation is just as of now, I got a request to sign a document, started to say, hey, we got to start sharing, get our act together. We have no power in this landscape anymore. We've abdicated our responsibility to the future. And instead, the question starts to become the things that make the AI machine operate. Where in that infrastructure does openness need to sit? And there's a fully valid response to say nowhere. It's all some, specifically negative damaging output. But there's pieces where you could say openness can have an actual impact. And if it's around the prompts, or I'd say perhaps most critically, some type of ontology or even a graph of learning materials, the pedagogical models that are being used, the data sets that are generated by a university, agentic architecture, all of these fit into something that can be shared that allows end users some degree of control over what happens, in their classroom and what happens in whatever landscape of engagement that they're involved with, whether it's workplace learning or whether it is embedded immersive learning, cooperative learning, and so on. So I'm just trying to emphasize that or leave a question. I don't know if emphasize is the right word, but leave the question that as these technologies continue to advance, that the parts of the equation where we're talking about open education, beyond just the access question, but individual control or autonomy or the ability to reuse or to remix or recreate, what changes because of the capability of AI to be this, combinatorial infrastructure and ideally to some level personalization. All right, so the tail end here, what I'd like to spend a bit of time looking at, with that just saying there's open series of challenges that should leave you wholly unsatisfied because it is such an unaddressed challenge and there's so limited dialogue around it. I was amazed to see the first system level response from the Perio Foundation, regardless of the tools and the approach that have been out for a while, we're locked into a lot of the traditional backward facing concerns. And I don't mean to diminish that. The backward facing concerns are traditional copyright and licensing infrastructure when we have a system that A does not care about that. And that system are the frontier labs. Then we have a system of opportunities in the education sector where our goal is to take the tools or the technologies at our disposal and give agency to individual learners to sort of create the kind of learning outcome or experience that's relevant to them, not necessarily the ones that we as university, faculty or leaders have decided were relevant. So I think the argument I'm trying to get at is what is a future facing lens of openness where a lot of the technologies actually give a completely different level of agentic control, and where in some ways the traditional framing of content or IP protection are no longer relevant. Where do we start to have a conversation that's more systemically focused? So one of my favorite citations from roughly forever was Manuel Castells did an interesting paper, and he essentially looked at a network theory of power. And he has a number of stage levels of network, and his view is that a network theory of power, where we're talking about the most effective mechanisms of control, it's around this ability to program networks according to the interests of the programmers and to have the power to make different parts of the networks function or be effective or impactful. And the reason I'm taking that approach is what is it, for my open question, is what is needed for the university system to promote a mindset of openness in a space where generative AI is becoming the dominant technology that many individuals interact with. Which parts of the system does openness enable the greatest capability, and which parts of the system are backward facing and not necessarily as relevant as they perhaps need to be? And in some ways, for universities in particular, it is about this idea of building coalitions that work. And it is about finding on an issue by issue basis where those capabilities can be realized more actively. So, as an example, for universities that are collecting a range of data sources on learners, that are starting to build models or starting to bring data from learners together with an ontology or a graph of content to be learned, and using that to engage with an individual student in a dialogic pedagogical model. That framework, where does openness sit in that model? Like, what is it that needs to be open? In many ways, the sharing capabilities, whether it's the data layer or the technology layer, or it is the prompts or the agentic infrastructure, the ability to start as a group of university partners to identify the issues that will make the biggest impact and give them a seat at the table together with some of the companies actually creating these products. And I'm specifically referring to your frontier labs. They're willing to listen if you bring enough learners to their table. And I think in a lot of cases, because we're somewhat disconnected from the overall conversation, namely OpenAI or Google or whatever, we're not speaking into those processes because we're not using the power and the control that we have. After all, higher education is the top use of LLMs. There's typical drop off come June, at least in North American areas. So wanting to emphasize it's the coalition approach on an issue by issue basis where you tackle where openness sits and makes the biggest impact. Now, of course, and again, many of you in this call are more capably versed in this domain than I am, but it's really about finding where can you drive engagement from an openness lens. I think many people here already are in open spaces. You contribute, you may be actively involved in using Hugging Face models. You may access data. You may have a personal blog for those of you that still imbibe in that ancient brew. And so there are places where we can be active contributors at a personal level. The part I'm trying to get to are more of these next two. From a coordination lens, a lot of the decisions being made, especially around governance and governance decisions, is making the social effects of openness felt across an institution. Like, what are the values that you've chosen to pursue? What are the governance model for AI deployment and utilization? Which critical partners do we use? It's the capability to share and coordinate these kinds of governance decisions across the university that'll be most critical. Similarly, strategy and strategy identification starts to become consequential in this conversation. And finally, ultimately, it's really about the systems level. We have a group that we're gathering together in April, in Boston, to look specifically at university partners that represent about 1.5, 2 million students, to say when we approach OpenAI or Anthropic and we have requests around expectations for the university sector, these are our expectations. If you want us to use your products in our classrooms or with our learners, these are the conditions or these are the expectations that we have. And I think for a lot of reasons, universities haven't used their collective power to influence this. There's a valid reason to say the whole thing sucks, it stinks, I don't like it. I'm not going to use AI ever. I'm not saying that that's an irrelevant topic to take off the table, but I'm trying to emphasize there are places of control that we are underutilizing in the university system. And I've already listed a number of these where I think these are critical spaces for us to start pooling and start bringing our resources together so that we have, for lack of a better word, more impactful and positive outcome. So I'm going to end there and see in the last 15 minutes or so if there are any questions or challenges that individuals want to kind of walk through. Shauna, not sure if you are with us. Over to you.
Okay, so I was just typing my question, so maybe others are still doing that. So I'll ask my question. What are some suggestions for how do we become more involved, and how do universities become more involved in this conversation? I think it's a legitimate point you're making that it's drastically affecting the education sector and without a lot of input. And I see all the time people complaining that we're not being consulted about, how much students can do and how much we want students to be able to do through AI.
I mean, you know, I think there's at some level. Now it's different in different regions. When I spend time in Australia, there's huge competition for international learners. And so your competitive lens is external. When I spend time with colleagues in the US, there is a heavy emphasis on competition with other university partners because they're the ones that are impacting our ability to, increase our own enrollment numbers. So we eye one another as competition for those learners, where much of the different regions, Australia has that external focus in trying to bring external learners into the country. So we're fundamentally competing with one another as systems. Other regions, I think in particular Europe, and to some degree from my experience in Canada, there's less of an active competitive culture within universities. But the argument I'm trying to unpack here is the competitive source that we face now isn't our peers. It's not other universities in many ways. It's a range of startups or frontier labs. And I know there's a lot of valid criticism around where models fail, but anyone who spends any time working with models at a reasonably sophisticated level quickly finds out, with the right kind of information flow, with the right kind of agentic capabilities, whether it is OpenClaw for all the enormous problems it introduces, it does start to look like we have an emerging tool set that enables us to be much more productive and effective as learners. And so that means external vendors, the providers that we have in terms of frontier models or big tech, if you're going through like Azure or Bedrock or any of the foundations that are being made available by the big providers, we're not using our collective framing in order to accelerate our own capabilities to engage with AI. So, I mean, that's the whole point of what I was trying to say. But what that means to your question specifically, Shauna, I think our ability to take to stop seeing other universities as competitive threats, if you will, and to start to turn our eyes to the frontier labs, to turn to big tech, to even some of the startups that are coming up, and to start to recognize that we have to be able to outperform those in terms of the quality of the experiences that we make available to learners. And we have to start influencing the capabilities that frontier labs are providing to reflect our pedagogical preferences or to start to reflect the values of the university system. So I don't know what that specifically looks like, but I think it's a fair agreement to start negotiating in blocks. One of the interesting things I've seen that has come out of Howard Brodsky's work on cooperatives, those of you in Canada, obviously I grew up in Manitoba, so I'm well familiar with your neighborhood co-ops, but AI cooperatives, university cooperatives in seeking services. The US, Unison was an example a number of years ago that tried to aggregate the effects of university purchasing decisions. So I'm trying to articulate that need to collaborate on some fundamental technology purchases, to collaborate on the models that are being made available to our student populations, and to collaborate across a range of those fronts gives us at least a seat at the table. And, again, to reference some dude, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu kind of framing. And I do think it's a legit concern for us to look at. So it's essentially any range of product purchasing through to pedagogical models, through to governance sharing, through to influencing the types of services and tools that are being made available. I think in many ways, it's just universities demonstrating leadership that allows them to collaborate and produce more than they're able to do as an individual system. The AI game is clearly not over. It's just starting in some fronts. And you're 100% right that with some of the public data that was scraped, that was a decision. And at that time, it was much easier to scrape data and clean it than it is to have it, be developed or expertly input. So, for example, I was a few months ago, I was in San Francisco and met with an organization called Handshake. And Handshake initially started off as university graduates. We want to move them into the labor market, give them an opportunity to, support that transition. And so they add value resources to universities that help graduates stay, get gainfully employed. One of the things that they started to do, however, was they realized that the biggest thing emerging models need to become more capable isn't to give them more slop or more Reddit conversations or more whatever else, but it's actually to have basic chain of thought reasoning that's well captured and expressed, exactly like you said in domains like biology, chemistry, and math. So what they did now is they develop a pretty nuanced infrastructure. They'll pay faculty reasonably well-ish, basically to replace them, but that's secondary. And they'll give them a series of questions and they'll provide a series of structured responses to it. And then what they do is take that output and sell it to the different labs, frontier labs that are building products to ensure that they have higher performant models. Now, that's one of those examples I was trying to get at, but on an issue by issue basis, there's one domain where if you had sort of quality, open chain of thought reasoning, that was available. Now, of course, it'll get scraped right away, but to make that available to universities or to make that available to universities who are building AI products, and in this case, it could be, as I noted earlier, you don't need the same curricular outputs in terms of open education with LLMs. Now, I'm not saying that with absolute confidence, but what we've done primarily is we built in the domains where we're creating course materials, a knowledge graph that details the specifics of what we want learners to be able to do. We have some exemplar content or materials that we bring in as well. But then when we're actually producing content to individuals, we are using the graph with the LLM, with the learner profile to create the academic content. So it's creating an interactive kind of a textbook that is relevant to the learner and based on some of the interests that the learner has. All of those parts have a different equation of openness. Like if you're creating a textbook or creating academic resource or creating, a video or a resource, to license that as open or reuse at some level is a fantastic output. But to begin to license your open materials, to begin to license your prompts, to begin to openly license these areas, these smaller disciplines, that's where I think we're going to start to see a lot more value in the long run. And universities that collaborate on how do we create our technology, our AI stack, if you will, but our technology layer in order to be able to do a better job of attending to the needs of learners by sharing and collaborating around the tools that we develop in one system and make available in the next system.